Eternal Health, episode number 32.
You're listening to the Eternal Health Podcast, where we discuss God's great design for your life in body, mind, and spirit. Your host is Laura Rimmer, who's a nutritionist, author, speaker, and health coach. Looking for yoga tips or the latest protein shake recommendations? Sorry, you're in the wrong place. If you're ready for no-nonsense, multi-layered health expertise drawing on evidence-based nutrition and biblical principles, welcome to Eternal Health. For show notes and to download your free 5-minute Optimum Health Scorecard, please visit laurarimmer.com. Enjoy the show.
Hi there, it's Laura Rimmer here. Welcome back to another episode of Eternal Health, or welcome for the first time if this is the first episode you're listening to. And if it is, then great to have you here, and you've picked a good episode to start with, because this is something slightly different to what I normally do. This is me being interviewed on another radio show, and it's an interview I did about 3 months ago for Cross Rhythms Radio, and this is my testimony of my path into spirituality, and I'm not going to say too much more than that now, so just sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea and enjoy this interview, and I'll speak to you again at the end.
You're tuned in to Cross Rhythms Plymouth 96.3 FM, and this is Life Stories. It's the show where, quite literally, I suppose what it says on the tin, we explore different people's life stories, their stories of faith, what that looks like to have that worldview here in 2017. And today I've got the pleasure and privilege of being joined by Laura Rimmer in the studio. Laura is an author of a book called The Alkaline 5 Diet. She's also a health coach and various other things besides as well. Laura, thank you so much for coming in.
Oh, great to be here, Dave. Thanks.
It's great to have you here. And I hear, we'll get to this later on, but you run a podcast, so you're used to being this side of the desk and doing the questions. So I've got my work cut out today. Laura, do you want to start, as we do on Life Stories, just from kind of the beginning, as it were, just a bit about yourself growing up, maybe your early kind of stories of faith and what life was like for you as a younger person?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Cornwall and didn't grow up in a Christian home, but I had the privilege, really, I guess, of at age, I think I was about 8. We lived opposite a church organist, and he noticed my sister and I playing out in the street, and he come and approached my parents and said, would your daughters like to come and sing in our church choir?
Oh, wow.
So mum and dad spoke about it, asked us. I was really up for it. So my sister and I joined this church choir.
Okay.
And I was there for many years, until the age of about 14. I think my sister left slightly earlier than me.
No way.
But that was my first kind of foray into faith, if you like. To be honest, it was it was a very high Anglican church, and
sure.
Maybe it was my age, I don't know, but I never really got the gospel message at that age. Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed the music, loved doing things like evensong, where we just sung psalms every Sunday evening. So I do remember, even at that age, thinking, I don't really get what we're doing here, all the incense and the bells and the bowing at the altar and all that kind of stuff, but I do remember thinking, even at that age, like probably 10 years old, wow, this man Jesus sounds quite fascinating.
Yeah.
So that was my first experience with faith.
So kind of an intro just into spirituality, some deeper questions of life. What's life about? I suppose just maybe pricking your conscience of that, for want of a better phrase, more than really exploring it much deeper.
Yes.
Than just enjoying singing in a choir kind of thing. Yeah,
and also I, being a church chorister, I went to a lot of weddings and a lot of funerals. So right, by the age of 11, 12, I probably attended more funerals than most people have in a lifetime. So I really got the kind of whole concept of life and death and
mortality and everything. Yeah. Sure.
So I think that was a good grounding. Mm-hmm. But at age about 13, 14, it became very uncool to be in a church wearing a robe, singing every Sunday.
Sure.
My friends kind of, didn't think it was very cool at all. So probably a bit stupidly, I left church at that age. And to be honest, got into the normal teenage stuff of drinking, started smoking, going out partying, and just really left my faith at that point.
Sure.
Probably looking back, felt quite lost.
Right.
Went off to university at age 8 and continued.
18, I assume.
Yeah. Went to just lots more parties and more drinking and all that kind of stuff. And began to feel quite depressed, because I went to university in Birmingham, and it was a real culture shock moving from kind of Cornwall to rural Birmingham. Yeah, and I was in quite a rough area of Birmingham as well, so just saw a lot of crime and dark stuff really, and really became very unhealthy as well. And so there was this, I guess at that point, spiritually I was in quite a dark place. But also felt really unhealthy, eating all the wrong stuff, eating loads of takeaways, smoking, drinking, all that kind of stuff. At the end of my first year of university, I decided, having got alcohol poisoning, I'm ashamed to say, I decided to make some changes. So started getting into natural health and started going to the gym and just working out, and immediately felt better in my body, at least, if not spiritually. And those changes made all the difference for me. Started eating healthily, started making my own food, like rice and salads and things like that, and green smoothies, and felt a lot better. Gave up smoking eventually. And then after university, so I studied law, graduated with a law degree, and then moved back home to Plymouth, where my parents were now. Right. And because I'd experienced the benefits of health and vibrancy and fitness on my life, I'd kind of got onto this path now of self-development. Maybe wouldn't have recognised at the time, but yeah, that's where I kind of landed. And being an avid researcher with a really inquiring mind that I am, just studied nutrition, really got into it, and started using myself as a bit of a guinea pig in terms of the health aspect. And I would run, I was running lots, running half marathons and things by this point, and just trying lots of different diets and really working out what was best for my health. And then also was now getting into things like self-development, so read books by people like Daniel Goleman and The Power of Positivity and that kind of stuff. So I was really also delving into the mental side of things, and that led me on, a couple years on from there, into the spiritual world. And I guess it was a natural progression, and I see this in many people, to go from being into health, fitness, wellness, mind health, into a kind of more spiritual realm. So that's where I went off on. I started getting into the new age. So I guess I took a kind of pick and mix approach to spirituality. So I took a bit of Eastern meditation and mindfulness, that kind of thing, some yoga, and reading lots of different spiritual texts, so things like the Tao Te Ching. I had a Quran, I had a satanic Bible of all things as well. Wow. And a Bible. So I had lots and lots of different spiritual texts, and was basically just making up my own religion. Okay, really interesting place to kind of pause for a second as well. We'll stop for some music, and we'll talk more about that. Really interesting place to be at, where you kind of, as you say, pick and mix spirituality and pick and mix life worldviews, I suppose. We'll talk more with Laura after this. You're listening to Cross Rhythms Plymouth, and we are into a life stories conversation. I'm here talking with Laura Rimmer, who's an author, a health coach, and is kind of doing that all from her perspective and worldview as a Christian. And we've just been talking there, or you've been talking about your journey from a child, getting involved in singing in a choir in a church, sort of, I suppose, dipping your toe into what that looks like in that whole perspective of faith and spirituality from that standpoint very, very early on. Then moving away from that, kind of not that cool when you're a teenager, being involved in that necessarily. Moving away, going to university, getting into some bad habits, some kind of bad life choices, which probably isn't that alien to most students, if we're completely honest about it.
going down that route and thinking, this really isn't fun, this isn't making me feel good, changing your health choices, trying to improve yourself, I suppose, is how you described it. Getting into self-improvement in a number of different ways, starting with eating well, exercising, really good things to do, then looking maybe deeper into psychological side of things, self-improvement, positivity, all that kind of stuff, and then drifting into spirituality. Do you want to, that's kind of where we left it, that's kind of where you got up to in the last section. Could you tell us a little bit about maybe why you took that next step to look at the spiritual side of things? Why didn't you just leave it there with kind of your physical well-being and your psychological well-being in those areas? Because I suppose for a lot of people listening, they might be going, well, that's it, isn't it? That's the sum total of what we are. Why did you think, I want to look into spirituality and that whole arena?
Because I wasn't satisfied, in a nutshell. It's all very well having a fit, healthy body and being relatively calm in my mind and understanding communication and all that kind of thing. But there was still something, I was craving something, there's something more.
Right.
And so after that period of university, I had a number of different jobs and had good jobs and kept getting promoted. In one of my jobs that I was in, I always had 2 part-time jobs. So I had a really varied life. I had lots of friends. I was doing things like dancing. I was doing lots of dance classes and singing in bands. I was a lead singer of a rock band of all things at one point.
Nice.
But
from a choir to a rock band.
Yeah, I know. And I'm now back in a choir, thankfully, which suits me much better.
That's funny.
But I always felt that I was searching for something.
Sure.
What else is there? There's got to be more to life.
So the question, sorry to interrupt, but the kind of the question of, well-being, physically all right, psychologically kind of okay, but there's still a question of purpose, still a question of what is this all about, why are we here, those kinds of questions. Is that what you're referring to in a sense?
Yes, and that's exactly where I'm going with this, because that was it. I saw in the self-development realm that was the key thing that they kept saying. You need to find your purpose.
Okay.
So in my mind, and what I was told through all these kind of like experts and gurus, was you need to find your own purpose. So then the next question was, okay, well, what is my purpose then? So I set out on this journey. I thought, is it setting up my own business, which I eventually did? Is it having a health website and writing books, which I did? It's like, yeah, okay, that's cool. But I still felt there's more. There's got to be more to life. This isn't it. Is it to make lots of money? So I set out to make lots of money, and I didn't ever become a millionaire or anything, but I was at a position where I was working part-time in my business, traveling the world. I'd have a holiday every single month, go to a different place in the world.
Wow.
I was happy and by the world's standards, I guess you could say, I had a pretty good life. Granted, I wasn't married, didn't have children, so some people might say, well, that's what you need to find your purpose or be fulfilled. But to be honest, like I live my life quite vicariously. I look around at other people, and I saw that lots of other people who had marriage and children still weren't satisfied. So
that question of purpose was still there for them. You're thinking, well, therefore children in and of themselves aren't necessarily that answer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kept staying on this path of, I knew there was a bigger, higher power. I knew there was more to this life than just us. It didn't stop with humanity. I knew there was something bigger. And I think because of my background in church as a child, I knew there was a God. I never questioned the fact that there was a God. But at this point, I was defining God more in terms of God is in everything. God is in everyone. So I guess a pantheistic point of view. So the divine in everything and everyone. And all we have to do is to find that higher divinity within us. So hence got into things like yoga and meditation, which would really focus on bringing out that divine in all of us. But I saw big flaws in that because I didn't feel like I was divine. And I would look around at people who had been into New Age spirituality and lots of other different spiritualities as well for a long time, and were supposedly way further down the path of their purpose and their spirituality than I was. But I saw big flaws. I saw in these people's anger and relationship breakups and again, there was big questions for me.
Really interesting stuff. We're going to stop for some more music, and then we'll talk a bit more about that. Maybe go towards a definition of what New Age is, what that actually means, because I suppose for some people listening, they might be like, okay, kind of get that, but not sure exactly. We'll talk a bit more about that, and then maybe what changed for you and where you're at now. Move into that a bit later on. So we'll stop for some music now and talk more with Laura after this. You're listening to Life Stories here on Cross Rhythms Plymouth 96.3 FM, and I'm joined by Laura Rimmer. Laura, you talked about in those last two sections about how you went from a perspective of self-improvement in terms of health, fitness, and well-being in those kind of areas of physicality and psychologically, I suppose. Then going into spirituality in terms of searching for purpose. And one thing you mentioned there, and if you wouldn't mind kind of maybe defining it for us a little bit, you said you got into New Age things and that sort of spirituality. What would you say that is? How would you define that?
Well, I think I've done a lot of research into this since I've become a Christian. I'm actually writing another book on this topic at the moment. So the irony is with the definition of New Age is that actually it's very old. If you look back to biblical times, it's religion outside of a saving faith in Jesus.
Okay.
So basically it's you get to decide, and this is the thing, it's very hard to pin down what exactly the New Age is, because I think it goes hand in hand with where we are in our kind of society now as well, the whole postmodern ethos of there is no absolutes, there is moral relativism, spiritual relativism, where we get to pick, and your truth is right for you, my truth is right for me, don't judge me, I won't judge you. So to say, there is only one way, one truth and one life, that is Jesus, obviously, we know now. I know, I didn't know then. Is kind of, that came across. So for me, I remember people telling me the gospel as a New Ager and thinking exactly that. It's very judgmental. It's very narrow. It's, we all get to decide. I'll decide for me, thank you very much, what my faith is. And so my version of the New Age, this is the thing, this is where it became very lonely for me, because I would take, say, the Tao Te Ching, the principles from that, and yoga and meditation. Somebody else, equally a New Ager, would take maybe tarot cards and searching for their spirit guides and looking at past life regression. So it looks very different to everyone in the New Age. So there's no real cohesion, there's no real sense of community. And you can kind of make it up as you go along, and I think that's a lot of the danger with this stuff. It's
really interesting to hear that, because I had done a tiny bit of research, barely more than sort of looking on Wikipedia, so not really research, but and what I'd seen when looking at New Age, because I didn't really know what it was, even recently as sort of early this year, and that was kind of what I found in researching, that it's kind of a little bit pick and mix. You used that phrase earlier. It's kind of a little bit of whatever you feel like, spirituality kind of thing, just dip into what makes you feel good type thing. And I suppose what you're saying in this is it's all really, if we're blunt about it, rooted in self and selfishness. It's all focused on me. It's like, it's how I'm hearing it, and what I've looked into very barely, is that it seems like it's all rooted in the world kind of revolves around me, or my world revolves around me, and I'm going to do what I feel like. Would that be accurate in terms of your perception of it, that it's just sort of self-reliant?
Yeah, totally. I wouldn't have recognised that at the time. I think a lot of people into the New Age think that they're being very selfless, and I think they go on the principle, and I certainly did, where I need to get me right, and I need to look after myself and love myself. That's a big term in the New Age, love yourself. The whole problems in life is because you don't love yourself enough, when you look in the Bible, it's like, actually that's the root of most of the problems, is that we are so
love
naturally
too much, maybe.
Exactly. So and the trouble with that is, I mean, for me, my experience was it got to the point where I almost kind of self-imploded. I was trying to search so much and trying to improve myself so much and look inward so much that I became very isolated. And I just, in all honesty, I saw the evil in myself and the sin. And again, I wouldn't have defined it as that. I would have called it something else, like stuff going wrong or whatever. But in reality, that's what it is. It was the evil and sin that I couldn't get out of. I couldn't work myself out of that own sin. It takes Jesus, doesn't it? An outside perfect person to drag us out of our own kind of mess, if you like.
Yeah.
So for me, it really got to the point where of almost despair. I was doing a lot of research. I saw a lot of dark stuff going on. I could see, like, you know, Satanism in high places in the world. I met a lot of different people in the course of my business, and I saw some really dark stuff.
Right.
And it kind of culminated for me in seeing a psychic medium.
Right.
And he told me some things which I don't doubt are from the spiritual realm, some things which were very accurate, and things which he foretold which have subsequently come true. But thankfully I had a good friend around me at the time. I had 3 strong Christians, and one of my friends told me very clearly, Laura, you need to turn away from this stuff because the Bible says that is demonic and it's bad news. And I said, well, that's all very well, but I don't believe in the Bible. So he said, I don't care, you need to turn away from that. And for him, he was a very gentle man normally, and he was very emphatic. So I went away a little bit disgruntled from that conversation. But thankfully I think God humbled me just enough to kind of take it on board and listen to these people around me who were telling me about Jesus. Laura, keep looking for Jesus. Seek Jesus. And it was kind of getting on my nerves a bit. But after that experience with the psychic medium, I felt a sense of what I can only describe as spiritual darkness and oppression in the little flat I was living in at the time, and that quite scared me. So it all culminated in this point where I just cried out to God. Right.
Amazing. If it's all right with you, we'll leave it there and then talk about what that looked like after that. We'll stop for some music and talk more after this. I'm in conversation here on Life Stories with Laura Rimmer. And Laura, you've talked so far about your life story up to the point really of finding faith in Jesus, finding a Christian faith. That's kind of where we got to in that last part. Just before you go into that and what the difference has been, how that changed things and where you are now, it was really interesting to hear in that last section that you were looking into spirituality in what you'd call, and people would call, new age kind of ways of thinking and ways of doing things, trying to satisfy yourself and trying to satisfy that question of purpose, of meaning, and all those kinds of things. Really interesting to hear how you said in that last section you were seeing a lot of darkness in that. Could you maybe talk to that point just a little bit of what that looked like for you, of just, because at the time you said you wouldn't see it as sin in yourself, but you felt there's still darkness in me, there's still darkness in other people, there's still darkness I'm seeing in these people who are allegedly enlightened, or whatever the right phrase is. Could you just talk to that a little bit of how maybe it is a bit darker than maybe people might think?
Yeah, sure. I think, we're in a time where yoga is offered at every gym. Meditation is now offered in schools to children. So those type of practices are completely normalized in our society and unquestioned by most people. And I think people need to realize, and I certainly needed to realize at this point, that there is a spiritual aspect to these different practices. And so, yoga as an example, it's not just stretching and breathing. It's rooted in Eastern mysticism. It's a Hindu practice. And, there is a spiritual realm out there. There's a spiritual realm of darkness, as well as the kingdom of light in Jesus. I think we need to be careful about that. And certainly from my perspective, I felt that darkness. And I've seen people who've come out of this and had to have deliverance from doing these kind of new age practices and things like I went to Thailand and was offered the chance to do astral projection, which is kind of, you go out of your body, you go into this meditative state and you move out of your body into the spiritual realm, and you separate your mind and your spirit from your body.
And that's how it's described to you when you're going into it.
That was how it was described.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and it was all described very nicely by this sweet woman. It's all described as kind of rainbows and light, pretty much. So I thought in my naivety, it all sounds good, I'll give that a go. Thankfully, circumstances, as it happened, I think the Lord intervened and stopped me from doing that. But subsequently now, in my research on these types of things, there's again a really dark aspect. If you're moving out of your body and seeking the spiritual realm, if that's outside of Jesus, the Bible is very clear that you're entering into a realm of darkness.
Just really interesting to just share that, I think, because just speaking from experience, because I feel like it would be wrong for me to say that because I've got no experience in that, but for you to say that you actually explored those things in the best possible way and like well-meaning, you were wanting the best for yourself, and I assume for the people around you in that sense, but you saw, and that's all you can say is your personal experience, is you saw a lot of darkness, and I have seen subsequently through talking to other people as well. We'll just quickly, time's running out again on this section, but if you could just share, then you said you cried out to God, is kind of where you got to in the last section, and went, okay, I realised that there's something here that I need to address. What did that look like? And a little bit before we stop for music, how that's been since.
Yeah, sure. So it got to the point where I just recognised that I thought I knew what I was doing here. I thought I could just choose my own path of spirituality, but actually I don't. There's much more going on than I know about, that I'm able to handle. So I just cried out and said, God, whoever you are, whatever you are, if you're just the universe, the source, if you're in me, if you're not in me, whoever you are, please show me the way, because I don't know what I'm doing here. And at that point I got this instant conviction: Jesus.
Wow, that's amazing. That'll be, I think, a very good place to stop in this section. And if you are tuning in and you're listening to that and you're thinking, wow, I've been involved in yoga and meditation and various different things, I felt it important to say, you don't need to be afraid. You don't need to be afraid of what you're hearing in this, that, oh, I'm tied into all this dark stuff. Don't be afraid of that. But hearing what Laura's saying of how she got out of that, and we'll talk more about that in this next section, so stay tuned. We'll stop for some music and then we'll talk more about what it's looked like for you to come out of that and the difference and the kind of light that you've come into, for want of a better word. It's a pleasure to be joined in the studio by Laura Rimmer. Laura, it's been a really fascinating conversation so far, just talking really about your life story. This is Life Stories after all, so that fits, here on Cross Rhythms. And Laura, you've got to the point now where you were a kind of well-meaning lady looking into kind of yourself, your own spirituality, your own life, wanting to live well as best as you could, just trying to find your own way in the world. Getting to this point that you described in that last section, having seen a lot of darkness through stuff you'd explored in New Age and spirituality, and getting into avenues where you're like, this goes down a pretty dark path, I don't want to go there anymore. Coming to God, finding Jesus, finding him in a very personal way, crying out to God. What happened from then, and how have things changed since?
So from then, when I prayed to God and said, show me the way, and I got this instant conviction that it was Jesus, and it wasn't an audible voice, but it was such a strong conviction that it just shook me. And I had all these objections come up in my mind. So, oh yeah, well, I went to church as a child, I explored looking at Jesus, and again it was like, no, it's Jesus. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Religion, strip away all the religion and stuff you saw as a child that wasn't particularly helpful. It's Jesus, you need to look to him. And then my next sinful thought was, oh great, I'm going to become a Christian. Like that was totally unappealing to me at that point.
And just a perspective in your mind of what a Christian looked like, I assume, like a stereotype kind of
thing. I don't know, like a do-gooder, or I'm going to have to give up all my fun
socks
things,
and sandals kind of thing.
yeah. So but it was such a strong conviction, Dave, that I had to listen to it. And at that point I think I would have felt like, I think this is the truth. So went into town, bought myself a King James Bible, took it home and read all the way through the Gospels, pretty much in, I think, over like a day. And reading in the Bible, there's names and dates and places and eyewitness accounts and people and events. It was such a breath of fresh air compared to all these ethereal spiritual texts that I read before, it was just fluff. You couldn't take anything substantial from it.
That's really interesting.
The Bible, actually, I was like, whoa, this is true. This is the truth. And I knew at that point I found the right path. That's
really interesting, just thinking about what you're saying and following your story. Interesting that you would see the difference in that, being someone who studied law much earlier in your life, that you would see that this is almost something that you could legally stand up with in court much more than these other texts I've looked at. That's a really interesting point. Okay, so then how did things progress from there? And if you can move things, I know it's probably a long story, but move things a little bit more to current and what that's looked like as making a difference in your life.
Yeah, sure. So at that point, I just repented. I got rid of all my New Age books, all my New Age paraphernalia, crystals and pyramids and statues and things in my home. Got rid of all of that, repented for literally about a week, and then emerged feeling literally born again. Like, I can totally relate to that phrase.
Wow.
Felt this lightness, this brand newness.
Wow.
And just, literally felt like a new person, which was amazing. I was dating a guy at the time who was a Christian, and subsequently, we thankfully he was praying for me hard as well at that point. So
was he quite open about that during the relationship, or kind of not necessarily?
He said, because I was asking him about his faith, he said that he knew I was going to become Christian because I was really interested in his spirituality and asking him questions. So anyway, a couple years on, we've got married, and now I'm in a position where it's just night and day, Dave. It's completely different. My life is so much richer. The purpose I was looking for, I found, to the point where actually, when I found Jesus, I was like, well, I'll just give up being in business and give up everything because I've now got Jesus. The Lord showed me, no, Laura, you have to stay in business. And so I'm using my faith, trying to work that out in my business. So I've just started a podcast called Eternal Health.
Okay.
Which is a kind of sidearm to my business in the natural health area, where I coach people and write books on natural health. And really, I started this podcast to bridge the people's interest in natural health and mindfulness and mental progression, and that's the wrong word, but positive psychology, I guess, and spirituality, but also from a truly biblical perspective. So I quote the Bible and give the gospel regularly in my show. That's
really cool. We'll touch more on this in the final part next, because what I found really fascinating in talking to you off air is how you've kind of recognized that there's a longing in people for searching for a purpose. There's a genuine longing in a lot of people in wanting the best for themselves, which is a really good thing, and wanting to eat well, to live well. That's a really good thing, which is rife across the society now, which is a good thing, and not to close that down. But what we talked about a bit off air is how that can often, as it did for you, lead into spirituality, which really takes a dark turn, but how it doesn't have to, and how it can still be rooted in who God really is, who Jesus really is, having that as faith, and that you don't have to, throw everything out if you come to Christ. We'll talk a bit more after this song, a bit more about that. Well, unfortunately, it's the last part of my life stories conversation with Laura. Laura, I feel like we could talk for 2 hours, maybe just make this kind of a longer show. But it is the last part. And Laura, you've talked a lot about your whole life story and how you found faith in Jesus, what that looked like, how it turned your life around. You talked about that in your last section, from really quite a dark place into much lighter, not to just use a cliche, but that was really how you described it. And as I mentioned at the end of the last section, you are now in a position where you're really bringing health in terms of physical, in terms of psychological, in terms of, I guess, holistic, whole life health into the public arena. Could you just share a bit with us what that looks like for you, why you're doing it, why you haven't maybe just gone away from all that kind of stuff, and how people can maybe access that?
Yeah, well, because a lot of mind, body, spirit stuff that so many people are rightly into these days is so rooted in the Bible. And I think a lot of, as Christians, sometimes we can throw all that out and think we're free in Christ, we're saved, I don't need to worry about what I eat and all that kind of stuff. But actually, if you look through the Bible, so in Genesis 1, God's given us the green plants and the fruits to eat. That was God's original design. Like, yes, we're able to eat meat now, and I won't get into all that kind of thing. But you see throughout the Bible, God calls us to be good stewards of what he gives us, and that includes our body and our mind. And we're taught to train ourselves spiritually, as Paul says, for godliness. So I think there's a real need for us to do that as Christians. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, so many people like me are searching. They're searching for more spiritually in their body, with health and whatever. And I think we're doing a disservice as Christians if we can't offer what these people are searching for in a biblical way, because otherwise they will go off into the copious amounts of avenues that are available in other spiritual spiritual practices.
Sure.
So that's really my heart for this. I started my podcast, Eternal Health, because I saw a massive gap. There's a lot of Christian podcasts, there's a lot of New Age podcasts, there's a lot of natural health podcasts, but none bridging all those three. From my research that I did before I started mine, all of the natural health ones have got some spiritual aspect, which for the most part is devoid of God. So I felt God calling me into that area to be a voice for Jesus, for the gospel, and for the biblical nature of seeking good health and well-being.
And one thing that, from my personal perspective on my faith, my worldview into this, is that following Jesus, following God, a Christian perspective isn't about a religion per se. It's not about another kind of set of ways to live per se, but it does encompass your whole life. If you really look at it and what you're talking about, it really does encompass your whole life. Jesus said, I've come to give life and life in abundance. It's about fullness of life and life back to how it was designed to be, with us being made by God in his image, all those kinds of things. Not wanting to preach, but just I think sometimes we can have, maybe like you did when you were almost going to become a Christian, that stereotype that it looks like this particular image. It looks like this quite maybe boring to some people image. And it's really interesting to hear, because you're kind of breaking down those stereotypes by saying, no, God wants you, and what it looks like to live his way is to live life to the full and to really be expressed in every way. And that's really interesting to hear.
Yeah, and not to go down that, I think we can go to an extreme with the whole health and wealth gospel, that God wants you rich, happy, healthy all the time. And when, we don't see that in the Bible necessarily. We see, Paul saying, you can expect to suffer for your faith, but there's a middle ground here. And for me personally, and other people who kind of get this, what I see is not the fact that we want to live forever and we want to be, totally have the body beautiful and all that kind of stuff. It's not about that. It's more, for me, certainly, I want to have the energy to be a good wife, to be able to run my business well, have the mental clarity to write my books, to be able to have the energy at the end of a hard day of work, to go out and speak to people I see on the street and share the gospel with them. That's what I want energy and health for.
Yeah. That's really good to hear. And, people listening to this, if you are listening, I guess one thing that you've touched on is, and there's a song by Larry Norman from years ago, why don't you look into Jesus? If you're looking into all these things, why don't you look into Jesus? Why don't you look into what love really is? Explore what love really can be and what really is, because it's not self-centered. It really isn't. And Laura, could you just give us out some places people can connect with you? You've written a book. Tell us what that is, where people can find that, and where people can find more about what you're talking about.
Sure. So my book is called The Alkaline 5 Diet, and you can find it in Waterstones, Amazon, usual places. My podcast is on iTunes. It's called Eternal Health. And you can find both of those things on my website as well, called laurarimmer.com. That's LauraRiMmer.com. And there's some free resources and ways to contact me there.
Perfect. Laura, well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you, Dave.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that interview. And if you have any questions about what I discussed, my testimony coming from New Age to finding Jesus, if you're wondering about this in your own life, then do reach out. I'm happy to speak to you about this. You can email me, laura@laurarimmer.com, or make contact via my website. And also I have a brand new course that I've just recorded that you might be interested in, called Choose Life, on how to find true happiness and fulfillment in life through coming through the New Age and into finding Jesus. So if you're currently on the path of things like law of attraction and positive affirmations, positive psychology, all that kind of stuff, but it's just not fulfilling you, then this is the course for you. It's a cheap little course, and it's all video based, so do check out my website, email me for details on that as well. And I'm going to leave you with some Bible quotes, and the first one is from Acts, the book of Acts, and chapter 3 verses 17 to 21. And now, brothers, I know you acted in ignorance, as did also your rulers. But what God foretold by the mouth of all the prophets, that his Christ would suffer, he thus fulfilled. Repent, therefore, and turn back, that your sins may be blotted out, that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord, and that he may send the Christ appointed for you, Jesus, whom heaven must receive until the time for restoring all the things about which God spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets long ago. And the second quote is from the book of John, so John's Gospel, chapter 3, verses 16 to 21. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode of Eternal Health. I'll be back with you soon with another episode. Until then, have a wonderful week and I'll speak soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Eternal Health Podcast. Go to laurarimmer.com to download your free Optimum Health Scorecard and find out your current health score, plus tips, coaching, and training on how to get slim, healed, and energized. Remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes, and we'll catch you next time on Eternal Health.